Thank you kindly. It's really an honor to be here with you, and I think you'll see what I mean by that shortly. Among all the things that I do, one of the things that's personally most important to me is to be an advisor to Students for Liberty. And it was a great honor when it was set up and they came to me and said, "We'd like you to be an advisor." And sometimes they ask me for my advice, and that feels good. But one thing that feels even better, and it may sound strange, is when I give my advice and they get back to me and said, "We thought about it, we talked to our teams, and we decided we're not going to go that way." Because they know better how to communicate with young people. And I like very much that Students for Liberty is an organization that is run by students and people who actually understand on the ground what needs to be done. The other thing that's very important to me is I'm a donor to Students for Liberty. Every month I give Students for Liberty a donation, and then at the end of the year I make as much of a donation as I can afford. And I have to tell you, it feels really good. And I hope all of you, when you get out of college and you're in jobs and so on, will think about that, and will think about becoming donors to this movement for liberty, because it's personally very, very rewarding and not that painful, frankly. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is the challenge that we face. So we celebrate our work, we celebrate our colleagues, and that's the right thing to do. But we also face a world full of challenges for liberty. And I want to talk about some new ones that, quite frankly, have surprised me. I did not expect years ago that we would be confronting these ideologies. At present, we have at least three symbiotic ideological movements that have emerged that oppose libertarian principles. We can start with one that we identify usually with the left, identity politics, and the zero-sum mentality that comes with that, political correctness, social justice warriors, and so on. The second, populism and the yearning for an authoritarian regime led by a strongman. And then the third one, radical political Islamism. And I'm very careful, of course, not to say Islam. It's not a religion. This is a political ideology. What's happening is that these movements oppose each other as rivals, but they're not offering contrary principles. They're rivals like political gangs are that are fighting each other, or street gangs. At base, they have the same ideology. And when one grows, it fuels the other. And we've seen this. The rise of the populist movements in Europe are fed very much by the rise of Islamist attacks, for example, and vice versa. These movements benefit when the other ones are rising. What's happening is that these rival forms of collectivism and statism are growing at the expense of what we might call the libertarian middle. People who want to live and let live, people who want to go about living their lives at peace with their neighbors. That's the space that is now shrinking as these other rival movements are growing. And we're entering really a new era of conflict. This is different from what we've experienced, let's say, in the last 25 years or so after the collapse of communism. A new kind of political space, people who want conflict. It's not that they need another seminar in how markets work. They get it in some ways. Many of them know our ideas, and they reject them. They don't want equality before the law. They prefer politics based on unequal equalities. They do not believe in your right to disagree with them, and they certainly will not defend your right to do so. They understand classical liberal or libertarian ideas often fairly well. These are not just ignorant people. They reject them. They have grappled often with our ideas, and they reject them. They have resurrected forms of collectivist thought that we thought were buried in 1945. And now language and ideas are reemerging that most of us of previous generations thought we would not see again. Trade is a zero-sum game for them. If someone benefits, they say somebody had to lose. And international trade is a plot against the working class or the nation or the race or something like that. It's all a conspiracy. They denigrate democratic politics, deliberative politics, discussion and debate. It's a fraud, it's a sham. It's just masking the underlying reality of life, which is unending conflict. That's how they see the world. They do not want to live and let live. And that poison comes in different flavors. There's a left-wing flavor and the right-wing flavor. But at base, it's the same poison. I've been spending a lot of time trying to investigate the roots of this, and here are some of the things that I've discovered. If we think about the identity politics of the left, one of the most important figures behind it is a man named Herbert Marcuse, who's a Frankfurt School philosopher who went to the United States, worked for the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, and then became a communist professor at UC San Diego. He said, if we want to achieve liberation, it means the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly from groups and movements which promote a long list of things he doesn't like. Moreover, the restoration of freedom of thought may necessitate new and rigid restrictions on teachings and practices in the educational institutions. Right? So we need to control thought in that sense. So this is really the most important source of what we call political correctness now in universities. It's not just in the United States or Canada. You see it around the world. Now, he made another appearance recently in a very funny movie, which I recommend watching, Hail Caesar, from the Coen brothers, that has a conspiracy of communist scriptwriters, all of whom are fabulously wealthy, trying to seize the means of production because they're being exploited. It's a very funny movie as they meet in this unbelievably expensive house overlooking the sea, and Herbert Marcuse is there as the Marxist theoretician. But he wasn't really a very comic figure. He left an extraordinarily poisonous legacy. He saw all human interaction as forms of violence. And as he said, the historical calculus of progress seems to involve the calculated choice between two forms of political violence, that on the part of the legally constituted powers, by their legitimate action, or by their tacit consent, or by the inability to prevent violence. What he's suggesting here is, when they don't shut you down, they are committing violence. He called this repressive tolerance. The most repressive form of society is the tolerant society. And he argued that the violence he advocated entailed cancellation of the liberal creed of free and equal discussion, intolerance even toward thought, opinion, and word. Think about that. He chose his words with great care. You would not be allowed to think thoughts not approved. Even thoughts are to be controlled. It's remarkably reminiscent of 1984. If you read that book, the most insidious crime of all is thought crime, because it sneaks up on you and you commit a crime without even knowing you're a criminal because you thought things that were not approved. And consequently, we've seen this move in the United States condemning freedom of speech that hurts other people's feelings, shutting down speakers, disrupting things, using violence. There's a movement drawing for this called the No Platform movement, to deny any platform to anyone who doesn't agree with you. And, by the way, stating it's okay to physically assault libertarians who merely defend freedom of speech. You can beat them up also, because they're defending the freedom to say things people shouldn't even think. And we've seen that play out very well. A professor of journalism at University of Missouri stopping a student reporter who was within his rights just recording an event. Hey, who wants to help me get the reporter out of here? I need some muscle over here. This was Herbert Marcuse speaking through this professor. Oddly enough, a professor of journalism, by the way. And what we saw recently in Middlebury College, Professor Charles Murray, racist, sexist, anti-gay Charles Murray, go away. He's not racist or sexist or anti-gay, but those words rhyme, so that's sufficient to get rid of him. Your message is hatred. We cannot tolerate it. He was physically assaulted, denied any opportunity to speak at the university. The professor who invited him was also physically assaulted. This is just really quite astonishing. Now, what has happened to this identity politics? What did it cause? Unfortunately, another form of identity politics. One identity politics calls forth another. And as we expect in such cases, they come along with all the other elements of collectivism, statism, and the zero-sum mentality. So this Richard Spencer character, so-called alt-right, they're not even subtle. When he spoke in Washington, he said, "Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory." This is not subtle. Sieg Heil. This is exactly what he was saying. And he thinks he's so clever that other people won't notice what he's promoting. In his speech, which someone recorded and put on the internet, he said the lying media, or to use the correct word, die Lügenpresse. And that is a very chilling phrase for all the German speakers here. The lying media. This is how the Nazis discredited the free press in Germany. And this new right-wing identity politics has new names. Nazi has a bad reputation, so they don't call themselves that. They're identitarians, race realists, human biodiversity, traditionalist, which does not mean what you think. It does not mean people who say, oh, it's our family tradition to do this on New Year's or something, we have a family tradition. That's not it. It's a rejection of modernity, a complete rejection of liberal ideas, and alt-right. They have conferences, publishing houses, and journals that are bringing back ideas from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And it's really very chilling to read this material. Now, inspired by these ideas, we have seen in Europe a new militant far-right identity groups that are marching for power. Jobbik's militia up here. This gentleman is now in the Slovak parliament. So here's how he looks when he's out in public. He's now a member of the Slovak parliament. And of course, the Golden Dawn. All these are parliamentary parties, by the way. This may look familiar to you, but of course, it's not what you think. It's a traditional Greek emblem. Of course, it is exactly what you think it is. They are just on one side of deniability. Now, unfortunately, illiberal regimes are already in power, less fascist than those. In Hungary, I'm going this afternoon to Budapest. Viktor Orban has said, we reject liberalism, we reject libertarianism, and he knows what that means. The Hungarian nation is not simply a group of individuals, but a community that must be organized, reinforced, and in fact, constructed. He understands his job. We are breaking with the dogmas and ideologies that have been adopted by the West and keeping ourselves independent from them to construct a new state built on illiberal and national foundations within the European Union. Let me translate the last 4 words. It means at the expense of German and Danish and Dutch taxpayers. That's exactly what that means. He wants the money from the European Union as much as he can get, but rejects any ideas of liberalism. So, this modern, illiberal, anti-liberal state subsidized by the European Union. And it is spread from one country to another. Jaroslav Kaczynski, he said one day we will have Budapest and Warsaw. He was not suggesting a change in the map. He was talking about this regime that has been able to put down roots in Budapest, now in Warsaw. And they're campaigning on blatantly anti-market and anti-liberty messages. Marine Le Pen, attacking privatization, attacking capitalism, attacking private property. Whenever a sector is transferred from the public to the private sector, this results in a decline in equality and an explosion of costs. I don't know what planet she lives on, but it's not the one I'm on. Very explicitly statist. And unfortunately, some people have been attracted to this because they seem to be campaigning against the left. But what they're doing is campaigning against the left using all the ideas of the left, of statism, cronyism, and power. There's systematic delegitimization of institutions. that check the will of the people, which means, in their minds, the will of the leader. And here we see Donald Trump in the United States. The fake news media, it is the enemy of the American people. That should be very, very chilling phrase. When political leaders designate someone as the enemy of the people, something bad is afoot. And then the attack on the judiciary, the opinion of this so-called judge, and consistent attacks on other institutions, the institutions that check power, the personal aggrandizement of power in the hands of one person. But he put it very neatly, as he said when he accepted the Republican nomination. He spoke to the nation. He said, "I am your voice." We don't need to hear your voices. I am your voice. Now, this idea is associated also with a concept people think is left-wing, but it turns out it's a far-right concept. Safe spaces, but safe spaces for their ethnic identity. One of these figures, Jared Taylor, an alt-right theorist, or as he says, human biodiversity, the natural tendency of human nature is tribal. And what they want is pure ethnic states, ethno-states, as they call them. And he says, oh, well, the left has been saying we should have that for minority groups. Why not for us? That's all we're saying. Why not a white nation in North America? And why not white nations in Europe as well? Why not? Isn't it a modest claim? When one of them was asked, the Spencer fellow, he said, oh, well, it would be voluntary, unless it didn't work out, in which case it would be coercive and probably would be really bloody. So, okay, I feel better now. Ethnic cleansing, and this is what they believe in. Now we're seeing it also from political figures. Donald Trump, again, imagine you have to put up tweets from a president. This was quite chilling. We should be able to decide who can and cannot come in and out. And I was struck by that phrase, come in and out. And already the United States is beginning procedures to require exit documents in the United States, which the U.S. has never had in its history. And just personally, I find that quite chilling as a move. Now, there's a common element among collectivists, the opposition to the not us, the rootless cosmopolitans, the merchants, the hucksters. And here's a figure who had a big influence on this. He wrote in a very famous book, "Let us seek the secret of the Jew, not in his religion. Rather, let us seek for the secret of religion in the real Jew. What is the worldly basis of Judaism? Practical need and self-interest. What is the worldly cult of the Jew? Huckstering. What is the worldly god? Money." Well, who was it who said that? Karl Marx, in On the Jewish Question. His attack on capitalism is that capitalism has Judaized Christian Europe. Many people haven't quite caught that in Marxism. It's a deeply anti-Semitic philosophy. And capitalism is hated because it turned Christians into Jews who worship money. This hateful ideology spread across the political spectrum and all forms of collectivism. As he talked about them, the lone-mongering Jews of Europe, the rootless cosmopolitans. They don't have any soil of their own. They don't share our interests. They conspire behind our backs. They manipulate us. And this language now, we hear it again, even in Europe, but they're usually more coded. They talk about financial interests. And in Hungary, they talk about New York financial interests. And that's actually quite clear what is intended by that and whom they have in mind. Now, that collectivist hatred of capitalism found very deep roots on the right as well. And we thought it had disappeared in 1945, but I want to introduce you to some of its most influential thinkers today. Their influence is much deeper than most people know. They're deeply influential among leaders of the left and the right. And a very important point, when we look at movements like Jobbik in Hungary, and we think, oh my God, these people are brutal street thugs. do not be fooled. Their leaders are very articulate, educated intellectuals. They are not primitive, dumb people. They may motivate some primitive, dumb people to attack people in the streets, to attack immigrants or foreigners or Jews or dark-skinned people. But the leaders of these movements are very educated, sophisticated people. So here are three of the influential figures, and I'll talk about them in turn. And their ideas are today experiencing a great revival. Let's start with Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, very difficult to understand. Anyone who's read his work will appreciate that. Here he is with his party membership pin, which he never took off, by the way, at the meeting of rectors of universities. He collaborated with Carl Schmitt, particularly at the purge of Jews and Jewish thoughts from the university faculty. Schmitt was a very intelligent figure. Here he is in his much later years, and quite committed to the cause of the Third Reich, despite his apologists' later denials of this. And here he is with Ernst Jünger, when Jünger was in military intelligence in Paris. He was an arch enemy of liberalism for his entire life. Jünger articulated the hatred that they felt for liberal society, their preference for struggle and violence and domination. He was a very brilliant artist, and again, we should not denigrate the intellect of these people. These are very smart people. In his book on the Storm of Steel in Stahlgewittern, about his experience in the First World War, he talked about how amazing it was to be a stormtrooper in that war. There are ideals in comparison with which the life of an individual, even of a people, has no weight. And he concluded this passage, "It is not every generation that is so favored." That's really startling, that he felt favored by having been in the First World War. Those who know European history know what a catastrophe this was. Millions and millions of people killed for nothing. The suffering was horrific. Jünger was celebrated, received the famous award from François Mitterrand on his 100th birthday. These figures generally lived almost forever. And became a cult figure on the left also, but maintained his hatred for liberty all throughout his lifetime, his hatred for liberalism. As he stated, he flirted also before National Socialism with the Soviet Union, and I found an interview with him from the 1970s when he was asked about his attitude toward the Soviet Union. "I was very interested in the plan, the idea of the plan. I told myself, granted, they have no constitution, but they do have a plan. This may be an excellent thing. Just any plan, not individual liberty, not spontaneous order, not free society. Any plan is preferable to that, whether it's National Socialism or Bolshevism." He attacked the idea of the individual right to live your own life. In a very chilling essay he wrote on pain, "Today we can say with some certainty the world of the self-gratifying and self-critical individual is over. Liberalism is finished," 1934. "And that its system of values, if no doubt still widespread, has been overthrown at all decisive points or refuted by their own consequences." They celebrated what they saw as the final end of liberalism. They wanted to do away forever free markets, trade, toleration, constitutional democracy, individual rights, equality before the law. In a very chilling paper written in the newspaper of the National Socialist Party, the Völkische Beobachter, "The genuine revolution has certainly not yet happened. It marches inexorably onward. The dictatorship will replace word with deed, ink with blood, the phrase with sacrifice, the pen with the sword." So there he struck all of the elements of liberalism replaced by violence. In his later years, he was celebrated as a darling. He collected hourglasses and was considered a charming old gentleman without anyone really inquiring into his past and the legacy he left behind. Martin Heidegger is another most interesting figure. His defenders denied he was a Nazi for years. He lied about it. We now know all of his claims were lies. We have his letters sending people copies of Mein Kampf, saying it's a wonderful book, you must read this. After the war, he denied ever having read it, that it was too vulgar. Of course, he wanted to save himself. But we know all of this was lies. And he set up his publications such that his books would appear years after he had died. These were a poison pill to the future. Now his works are coming out that explain his political ideas. Having had a huge impact on intellectual life, now the implications are coming out as his books are being published. In one of his lecture series that he considered the most important of his books, we have the advantage that the question of who we ourselves are is timely, as distinguished from the time of liberalism, the I time. Now is the we time. Now is the time of collectivism. All three of them believed that what mattered was the distinction between friends and enemies. And here's a book I recommend very highly for thoughtful advocates of liberty to read this book by Carl Schmitt. It's one of the most interesting and intelligent criticisms of libertarian ideas that I've read. He did read libertarian writers, Schumpeter, Franz Oppenheimer, and others, and he grappled with them and rejected them. He says what characterizes politics is the distinction between friend and enemy. An enemy, he says, isn't just the person you don't get along with. It's not the neighbor whose dog barks all night that you want to argue with. It's not your personal enemy. The enemy exists only when, at least potentially, one fighting collectivity of people confronts a similar fighting collectivity. Now, what's interesting here is he talks a lot about enemies, but not very much about friends in the book. But he makes it clear the only way you can have true friends is when you have enemies. That's what makes us friends, because we are united against them, against the enemy. In his case, the enemy, of course, were the Jews as the primary enemy, and they were an internal enemy within the German society. But any enemy will do to unify you as friends. A complete rejection of liberal ideas of mutual benefit, of toleration, of the idea of being able to live together and not requiring enemies to have friends. Now, these men were not tricked into National Socialist illiberalism. This is what the story was after the war. Oh my God, I had no idea. This is hardly plausible, and we know it is utter falsification. They told us in their own works what they believed. And interestingly enough, the ones from the National Socialist period were suppressed and had to be revived many years later. Schmitt's books after the National Socialist dictatorship were much more explicit than those before, but after the war, only the books from before the dictatorship were reprinted, not the ones under the dictatorship. Go back and read those, and you'll see what he really believed. As Heidegger put it, he said that the German people as a whole is coming to itself, finding its leadership. This is not very subtle, what is involved here. Hitler as the leader of the German people. This is obscure, no doubt, and they hid it for many decades. But when you look at their record of what they did, they were actively complicit in one of the greatest crimes of humanity. And these men took an active role in these horrifying crimes. Now, the Third Reich was defeated, but these ideas actually persisted. They were transmitted to the future, and they've had a big impact. Ideas such as authenticity, struggle and conflict, identity and tradition, ground and soil, and a very poisonous one, polylogism, something Ludwig von Mises took great pains to refute in his books. He considered it one of the foundational attacks on liberalism was polylogism. The idea that there's a logic for bourgeoisie and proletariat, for Germans and Jews, blacks, whites, men, women, and so on, such that these are totally separate spiritual entities or domains. And from that we get political correctness, abandonment of reason, and so on. Now, interestingly, I did mention political Islamism. This shares a common root. The founders of the Islamic Republic were explicit Heideggerians. They were influenced by Heidegger. They introduced Heidegger's thought into Iran and used that as the foundation for an authentic existence. It was an installation of a Heideggerian state. Ali Mirza Passi, an Iranian liberal-oriented thinker, has documented this very effectively, as have other Iranian liberals, the influence of Heidegger, Schmidt, and others in the foundation of contemporary Islamism. But also on the left, Slavoj Žižek, who may be known to some of you, one of the most famous European Marxist circus clowns around, a very prolific and energetic writer. And in his writing on Schmidt, he embraces Schmidt and says, well, in contrast to Schmidt, he actually misunderstands Schmidt in some important dimensions. He didn't know Schmidt identified an internal enemy, which was the Jews. He thought it was all the external. But he said, no, we'll go better. Because a leftist position should insist on the unconditional primacy of the inherent antagonism as constitutive of the political. Inherent antagonism. That's what life is about. Constant struggle against other groups. Now, contrast that with the ideas of Mises and Adam Smith and Hayek and others about the way in which people can be beneficial to each other. Your benefit need not mean my loss. We can benefit together through trade under the rule of law. That's what it's about. These people reject this entirely. Because life is nothing but, as Zizek put it, the unconditional primacy of the inherent antagonism. That is what we face. Now, those identitarian ideas, it's a new name for violent racism, are being rapidly infused into European conflicts by very intelligent ideologues. This is the Greek foreign minister, he's a professor of political science. That's Alexander Dugin. They're rather close. Dugin's a very interesting figure and quite influential now in Europe. Here he is some years ago when he was a founder of the National Bolshevik Party in Russia, a party you can kind of get from the flag here. They promised to deliver the best of Stalin and Hitler. So not very promising from a liberal perspective, but a fusion of these two great ideologies of Hitlerism and Stalinism. Here he is with his friend, some of you might recognize, probably most will not, in Moscow, David Duke. David Duke is the leader of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, a racist hate group and terrorist organization. Here's Duke at one of his political rallies speaking with what they call the arrow of Genghis Khan, expansion in all directions, founder of Eurasianism, and has a lot of money, largely because of the backing of Konstantin Malofeyev, who is a crony of Mr. Putin's, who's putting money into it. He has called for genocide in Ukraine, and he used the correct word for it. This was deleted shortly after, but some journalists got the screenshots of the tweets beforehand. Anyone who calls for genocide knows what they're talking about, and he certainly does support that. Now, there's a common thread behind this, a lot of money pouring into Europe. And it's coming from an identifiable set of sources, and they all trace back to the Kremlin. There's a book I highly recommend if you want to understand the contemporary media scene by Peter Pomerantsev, who spent 20-something years in Russian broadcasting. Nothing is true and everything is possible. What we're seeing is an onslaught, an attack on liberal institutions. that is not like the ones we saw in the past. We have to understand the difference. In the past, illiberal ideologies said, our view is better than yours. Soviet Union is more wonderful. In the Soviet Union, we will have more consumer goods. Fascists said, we will have more, we will outproduce, we have more dignity, etc., etc. They don't say that. What they say is nothing is better than anything else. Everything is crap. So you say you have freedom of speech, oh really? And then they'll bring forward some counterexamples. Some bad things that happen in France or Germany or US or Denmark. And they say, so don't lecture anyone else about freedom of speech or toleration. Nothing is better than anything else. As he puts it, Pomerantz says, the Kremlin switches messages at will to its advantage. It gets inside of everything. European right-wing nationalists, they say we're anti-EU. The far left, we're fighting US imperialism and hegemony. Religious conservatives, we're fighting against the homosexuals. They always find a message that they can go out to seduce groups into an anti-liberal attitude. And behind it all, we find one looming presence. Now, I mentioned the language that we are seeing reappearing, and Steve Bannon, a figure in the Trump White House, is well acquainted. He knows Dugin, he knows Julius Evola, and people who drop names like that into conversation are signaling something, in my opinion. They know these ideas fairly well. Here we have Ernst Jünger, and here we have Donald Trump reading Steve Bannon's speech. We will no longer accept politicians who are all talk and no action, constantly complaining but never doing anything about it. The time for empty talk is over. Now arrives the hour of action. No more talk. No more parliamentary debate. Now is action. Now, Liberty has a very different approach. We believe in deliberation. We don't dismiss talk and conversation and debate and discussion. Hayek put it very neatly. Liberty is about adhering to the rules. And in The Road to Serfdom, he warned us of this alternative philosophy. It is the general demand for quick and determined central government action that is the dominating element in this situation, dissatisfaction with the slow and cumbersome course of democratic processes which make action for action's sake the goal. It is then the man or the party who seems strong and resolute enough to get things done who exercises the greatest appeal. Christopher Hitchens, when he went to North Korea, suggested that the North Korean leadership had read 1984 not as a warning, but as a how-to manual. I think Steve Bannon read The Road to Serfdom, not as a warning, but as a how-to manual. Because what we're seeing playing out is described so well by Hayek in that book. So he said, this fear of trusting uncontrolled social forces is closely related to two other characteristics of conservatism. And here he has in mind a particular idea of conservatism. Its fondness for authority and its lack of understanding of economic forces. And we're seeing this come out very strongly in political rhetoric in the United States and Europe. I'm very proud of Students for Liberty for many reasons. One is continuing Hayek's quest for liberty. Wolf von Leyer, our leader, if you will, with Students for Liberty, put it very neatly when he spoke in Washington, D.C. Our ideas are beautiful because they are effective, they are humble, and they are optimistic. We do not claim to have the great plan that will make everyone happy and solve every problem. If only you give us power. Just trust us with power, and we will make everyone happy. That's not the Students for Liberty message. We don't have the knowledge what it would take to make everyone happy and solve every problem. We don't promise that. We're humble. We believe in many experiments and letting people solve their own problems and come up with ideas that hadn't occurred to anyone else. But we're also optimistic. We believe in the long-run power of ideas. I've been working for liberty in Europe for a very long time, since long before the fall of the Berlin Wall. I found some pictures a while ago myself. This is me expressing my opinion of communism a very long time ago. I met with libertarians in Romania. I flew there immediately after Ceausescu was executed, and we had very important meetings with the Romanian liberal thinkers, organizing them, coming to France. This was me here in Central Europe, and during the revolution in Prague, where I came from Vienna and brought 100 copies of The Road to Serfdom that I had smuggled out of Czechoslovakia at the time, that had been translated by Tomáš Ježek, and there were 6 copies in the country, and I made 100 more and brought them back, and now there are 106 copies of The Road to Serfdom. And we began to organize libertarian clubs. I also brought in 5,000 sheets of paper and 2 photocopying machines, and you can imagine how fun that was on the train. And especially when I was arrested by the border guards and had to argue that I always travel with this sort of thing. And I had an official invitation from the Academy of Sciences of the Czech and Slovak Federal Socialist Republic, and I think that Comrade Bruzák will be very disappointed if I'm delayed any further. So they let me go. I'm very proud of Students for Liberty, though, because I know that this movement will carry on this tradition and this fight for liberty, for dignity, for peace, for everyone and everywhere. And that matters to me very, very much. And it's been wonderful to see the growth of a movement on every continent, involving people of every race and religion and creed who have a common vision of a society of liberty, of people being able to live together without violence or conflict. So I'm very proud of all of you, and I want to thank you personally for everything you're doing for our freedom. Thank you so much.